My name is Mike DePalma. I'm the VP of Business Development at Datto. For those of you not familiar about what we do, we have a lot of products through security and remote monitoring, but the kind of key product that we offer is business continuity and backup and disaster recovery. So I've been with Datto about 8 years. Mostly my job is just to go around and do these kind of educational presentations. So if you want any information about the Datto product line or anything, talk to the folks at Sunset. We don't sell direct at all, so we only sell through the channel. Sunset's been a great partner of ours for as long as I've been at Datto, so we've done a lot of joint events together. But Datto's been around 15 years, going on 16 years. Again, through acquisitions and mergers, we have expanded our product line. The company actually started, the founder was 22 years old. He started building these little backup devices by hand in his parents' basement. And earlier this year, we got acquired for $6.2 billion. So he's pretty well off 35-year-old right now. So we're about 2,200 employees worldwide. We've got 27 offices, and we have our own data centers. We've got 9 data centers around the world, 2 here in the States, 1 in Pennsylvania, and 1 out in Utah. It's actually one of the largest private data center networks in the world. We protect over an exabyte of data in those data centers. But we're going to talk about security and the importance of it, and it's been an ongoing evolution in that space. And there's a lot of great vendors, and Datto has a lot of great technologies. But ultimately, if you're going to start your security plan, as cliched as it sounds, you have to have full buy-in from every single person within that office and within that organization, because all the technologies in the world are great, and it's typically not the technologies that fail. When you look at what these criminals are doing, they're relying on human error. And they're relying on somebody who's going to click on an email they're not supposed to. They're going to go to a website they're not supposed to from their work device. And they're going to find their way in. So before you even get into the technology piece, you really have to educate everybody within the office about the threats that are out there, about ways that they're getting in, and a lot of these things are simple. So a lot of times when folks think of technology, they're thinking of a cost center that they have to spend a bunch of money on, or an X amount of their budget every single year. But the reality is, a lot of the ways that you're going to prevent these folks from attacking you is just educating everybody in your office and creating the processes that will help you make that a sustainable technology security platform and kind of mentality throughout the company. Because you could check off one of these boxes, 2 of these boxes, but if you're not checking off all 3 of these boxes, and I'll give you a simple example, multi-factor authentication. Eventually it's going to be the complete law of the land throughout the entire economy. It'll reduce these attacks by 99%. And this is not something that's going to cost you money. You could usually just turn these on any of the SaaS applications you're using. But if you don't have the training in place or the processes in place, I'll give you a real life example. This was an example a partner gave us. The person was actually in the room. At the time, they were not a client of this particular partner, and they had implemented multi-factor authentication. They went through the process. They had the 30-minute webinar that everybody was supposed to watch. The very first week that they had implemented multi-factor authentication, the CEO of this company, on a Saturday afternoon, was out with his kids, Little League game, taking videos, and a little alert popped up, "Did you just try to sign in?" Now, this is the CEO, probably didn't go through all the trainings, and just clicked yes so that he can get on and take his pictures. The technology didn't fail. It was the process that failed and the education that failed. And he just opened the door and let them right in. So again, understanding all of these threats are very critical. And when you look at ransomware in particular, this is the biggest threat that we're seeing out there. And I've been giving ransomware-specific presentations for 8 years now. And 8 years ago, you'd see a lot of people kind of looking at their phones. Maybe they heard of it. Maybe they saw a story about it. As the years have gone on, we get a lot more head nods. A lot more folks in the room have been either attacked personally, they've obviously read stories, or they have a client or a vendor that's been attacked. And the genius behind ransomware specifically is that, 8-10 years ago, they were only attacking businesses that had really valuable information, information that could be sold on the dark web, those type of places. What ransomware does, it's essentially just encrypting your data. And there's different forms where they actually are stealing the data as well. But they're just encrypting it and saying, here's the key. For some Bitcoin, I will give you that key to unlock all that data. And it allows them to cast this huge net. And it is now a corporate structure in this criminal world. It's not the guy in his basement anymore. We saw it with the Colonial Pipeline attack, where the words ransomware as a service kind of came out. Now, us in the technology space, we've known a lot about that for years, but essentially there's the smart guys that are creating the viruses, and then they're selling them off. It's almost like a franchise program. Anyone can open up their own franchise of ransomware. And there are places right now, all around the world, where there's businesses and people are sitting around, around the water cooler talking about the playoffs that are coming up or last day in MLB season. And after their break, they'll go and sit down and they will have a quota, just like every other salesperson, to attack a certain amount of businesses every single week. And you have the home run hitters who will go after the large organizations, the folks like the Colonial Pipeline or the municipalities or hospitals. And then you have the majority of these folks who are singles hitters. They're going to go out and attack mostly small to medium-sized businesses because they know, A, they're going to have a higher success rate of getting through, but more importantly, they're going to have a higher success rate of actually getting paid. And it's not necessarily the biggest threat that you'll never get your data back. It's the length of time it takes you to get that data back. And we see it. So it's always that downtime and the ripple effects that far exceed the cost of the actual payment. And there was a pretty sad story, and there's a million stories out there, but there was a university that had been around for 157 years, a smaller university out in Illinois. And they got attacked in December of last year, right during admission season. And they didn't pay. The government has always told you not to pay for a lot of reasons, one of them being, embolden these folks. But they went and they tried to restore all their data. 3 months later, they were actually finally back up online, but by that point, their enrollment had fallen to the point where they had to close their doors. They'd already been impacted by COVID, and then they had to close their doors. 157 years. And that wasn't because they were never going to get their data back. It was because for 3 months, they had lost all productivity. And I mentioned the government, they had always, and I get a chance to present along a bunch of folks from the FBI and Department of Homeland Security. I'm actually doing one next week with an FBI agent. And they've always said in these meetings, don't pay the ransom. You embolden these folks. You put a bigger bullseye on your back because a lot of times it's like the bully in the cafeteria. You show them that you're going to pay once. They're going to keep attacking you until you stop paying. But finally, the Treasury Department put out a statement back in fall of 2020 where they said that not only are you not supposed to, by paying the ransom, you could be at risk of violating the law. Not because paying a ransom is necessarily illegal. If somebody, while I'm out here in Nashville, goes and steals my dog, I could pay that ransom. The reason being, a lot of times the folks behind these attacks are terrorist organizations. They are enemy nation states. That's one of the ways we could put all the sanctions on these folks we want, but one of the ways that they know they can make money is through these cyber attacks. And so you could be at risk of violating the law. Now, they're almost always going to ask for the money in Bitcoin or Ethereum or one of the cryptocurrencies because they know there's very little risk of them being caught or that money being reversed, so they're not going to ask for an ACH or credit card. So there's not a lot of teeth to a statement like this because ultimately they're not really able to tell whether you're paying a terrorist organization or not. But it shows you the direction that all of these regulations are going in. It's basically saying there's all the regulations in the world that can look great on paper, but they're not going to stop to catch any of these folks or prevent any of these attacks from happening. What they're doing is they're shifting the burden over to the business community, saying it is your job to protect your data, your client data, your patient data, your employee data. Because even if you are able to survive one of these attacks, they're still going to come knocking on your door and say, hey, show me that you did all your due diligence. Because if not, there's going to be fines and all of those type of things that come on behind it. And to that end, when you think about the options, and a lot of folks will just say, well, worst case scenario, I'm going to go out and I'll just create a Bitcoin account and I could pay that Bitcoin. Now, A, you're not dealing with a honest group of people here, so it's not like an honest business transaction, although a lot of times they do give the money back. But the other big piece of this is the government is now saying if you do pay that ransom, you have to report that within 48 hours. And some states actually have a list where anybody can go and see the companies and the offices that have been attacked. So the ripple effects to this are not just the financial impact, but the reputational impact. The idea that you are the practice in your area that's been attacked. Think about, a lot of the conversations we had this morning are about, how are you driving your business and, adding additional patients and all those things. All the great marketing in the world is going to really be tough to overcome an attack like this. And so, we do internal ransomware reports every single year. We use a lot of third-party data. And we had been public, so we got a lot of good public data about these things. But because we live in the world of ransomware and breathe it every single day, we wanted our own numbers. And so we've done it for the last 6 years. What we found was that there's a lot of common themes. Now, when we looked at these numbers, and we run our report from July 1st to June 30th, so it'll say 2020. We're actually going to have the 2021 numbers coming out this month. But we saw, a couple of things. Healthcare industry is still the #1 industry that's being attacked. Now, one of the reasons being that we saw a bigger spike in this over the last couple of years was because these criminals are very opportunistic. And what industry had more pressure on it over the last 2 years than the healthcare industry? So they were poised and ready to go in and attack that. But it also shows you, if you go down the list, that again, every single office is vulnerable to this. Because again, they don't necessarily care what your data is. They just know that you can't operate without access to it. So they know that they're going to get a lot of folks to pay. And one of the other things, and the reason why it's tough to use, just third-party kind of public reports, is because only about 25% of these attacks get reported. Most people try to handle it on their own because of that reputational impact, and because, to be honest, the government wants you to report them, but the FBI doesn't have resources to go and investigate a $10,000 ransomware ask. They don't publicly say the threshold, but I've heard anywhere between maybe $100,000, $250,000, maybe even higher before they start to dedicate resources to it. So if you're in the position of, hey, I don't have access to any of my systems, any of my data, and the clock is ticking, you start doing the math and say, hey, I could pay $10,000 right now or be down for a week or more. Well, the math probably makes sense to pay that ransom. And so we're seeing that. And one of the things that we also see is that what you really need to think about is this multi-layered approach. I mentioned technology being one column of that. When we talk to the businesses that were attacked, 60% of them had some sort of anti-malware filtering in place. A lot of them had endpoint detection. Doesn't mean you shouldn't have this and it shouldn't be part of your technology stack, but it just shows that it's not a commodity that you can just go out and buy. This is not something where you could just hear an ad on the radio and say, I know I need to make an investment in security. This product seems good. They say that it's foolproof and all the rest. Any vendor out there that's going to tell you that at 100% accuracy, they're never going to allow a criminal into your network is not being honest with you. Because again, a lot of those times it's human error that's letting those folks in. So it needs to be part of a multi-layered approach. And so when you start to go back to that people, process, and technology, that technology piece is not just some shiny object that you're going to be able to buy. Because again, there's always this race against the criminals. Unfortunately, some of the best and the brightest are heading over to the dark side, and so it's an ever-evolving piece. But what we find every single year is that the biggest impact of one of these attacks is loss of productivity. It's not, again, that you're never going to get your data back. It's how long are you down? And I could tell you within our studies, the average length of downtime from an attack is about 20 days before you're fully up into a production environment where you have access to everything that you need for your office to run smoothly. The Department of Homeland Security, I was on a panel with them recently, their number is 16.2 days. So pretty much in line. We're talking about days or weeks on average. So you start to think about how long your office will be able to keep its doors open before it really starts to impact not only your bottom line, but the loss of patients and all these different types of things. This is the big number. And I could remember a few years ago getting up on stage and talking about the findings from our report, and the average ransomware ask was $4,300. The average impact at that time was about 10 times higher. The average impact was about $46,000. It was a big number. When you look at where those numbers have gone over just the last few years, the average ask is not increased a lot of money. It's about a few $1,000s, but the impact is now over $300,000 per attack. That's on our internal report. When you look at the Department of Homeland Security or FBI, their numbers are in the 7 figures. Now, the number itself is I don't really like to use the dollar value number because it varies so much by the size of your practice and all these different types of things. So one of the things to go back to the office and try to put a value on is what would a day's worth of downtime really cost me? What would a week's worth of downtime really cost me? Because that's the leverage that these criminals know they have. And the scariest number within this report was that, and it's a little jumbled here, I don't think it transferred over well when I forwarded it, but when we talked to the business community, only 3 in 10 CEOs were highly concerned about these attacks. I could tell you when we get these numbers back in the next couple of weeks, it'll be a banner year for these criminals. 7 in 10. And what they're trying, 7 in 10 are not highly concerned about it. So despite the fact that this is a multi-billion-dollar year industry, and another cool stat that I heard was that if you were to aggregate all the money that these cyber criminals make on a yearly basis, it would be the 9th largest economy in the world, just ahead of Canada and Brazil. That's how much money is being made. And the business community isn't doing anything to stop these folks. So they don't have to change their business model. Why would they? They know it's been working. They know it's going to continue to work until that number goes up. The scary part about this is the prior year, that number was 41%. 41% of respondents said they were highly concerned. Somehow it went in the wrong direction. And so I'm really hoping that, all of the news stories that we're seeing or folks that you might know that have been attacked start to increase that number, because that's a scary number. And so the conversation really needs to shift from just cybersecurity, which every single tech conference you go to, that's all they're talk about, cybersecurity, to the evolution of the idea of cyber resilience. How resilient is your practice to absorb one of these attacks? And there's a lot of different frameworks out there. We follow the NIST framework. But the one suggestion I would have is just pick one of these established frameworks and follow it. But essentially what the NIST framework is trying to tell you to do, the first thing to do when you leave here is to go and identify all the different assets that you have, where all that data lives. We have this huge data sprawl. It used to be very simple. You had an on-premise Windows server. That's where everything lived. Now with all the different software as a service applications, and maybe you're partially up in Azure or something like that, and you're trying to do all these different types of things. Identify that. But don't just identify where the data is. Identify who has access to that data. Because one of the things that we saw, especially when we had this, everybody had to go work remote and all those different types of things, was as a lot of folks in a lot of offices implemented some of these tools, they gave carte blanche admin access to everybody. Criminals love that, because now they can get to one person, they can now get access to everything that they need to, and anybody. And we saw a lot of that. So identify where everything lives, where that data lives, how it's being protected, where it's being backed up, and then who has access to it. Make sure everybody has access to the tools that they need, but that they only have access to the tools that they need. And from there, you could put together a protection plan and start to figure out how we're going to protect all these assets. Those are the two components of the cybersecurity side. And a lot of folks and a lot of offices kind of stop there. But what happens after the attack? Even when the FBI director was on the floor of Congress getting grilled about the US government attack, and rightly so, he was very open and looked right at the camera and said that there's no way we could ever tell you that we're completely safe from every single attack that's happening today and tomorrow. So the cliche term is always, it's not if but when, but it's true. And so what happens after that attack? How quickly can you detect that attack? Because I could tell you what they want to do is they might not detonate that ransomware right away. You might not get that scary red screen with a Bitcoin ask. They're going to want to get in there and get their hands into everything that they can. And that usually includes the first thing they go to is your backup. And they're going to try to encrypt that backup so that if you do find out, hey, we've been breached, I'm going to go restore from my backup. Well, hey, this has been encrypted as well. And so they're going to want to get their hands onto everything and then ultimately pop up that scary red screen that says, hey, everything's encrypted, and hey, we're going to need some money to unencrypt that. And then how quickly are you responding to that? It's great to detect it, but what are those steps? It goes back into that people, process, and technology. If the fire alarm went off right now, we would all pretty much know where we need to go, and we understand that. But I could tell you, before I came to Datto, if I had clicked on something I wasn't supposed to and got the scary red screen, my first reaction was not walking down the hall and going to tell my boss, hey, I think I just encrypted our entire network, right? What I would probably do is try to figure it out on my own or call a buddy who's techie and say, hey, how do I do this? And the longer I wait, the more access these criminals have. So what are those processes? What does that response look like? Who do you pick up the phone and call? How do you isolate a machine? All those different types of things. And then ultimately, what does that recovery time look like? Backups are great, and the criminals know that most everybody's backing up their data, but it's only as good as the speed in which you can recover that data. So understanding this full loop, basically, if you look at that protection side, we know on average, before you get to that full recovery, it's about 16.2 to 20 days. The idea here is to try to make that loop close a lot faster than that. And the other way to kind of look at it And our Chief Information Security Officer explains it this way, and I really like it because I think it's a little easier to understand, is on a linear basis. And he always says the phrase, all right, what happens on the right-hand side of the boom being that attack. So you're doing everything on the left-hand side of the boom to protect all your data and identify it and all that. But the real race begins on the right-hand side of that boom. The boom occurs, and by the way, this boom could be a natural disaster, it could be a lot of different things, whatever that downtime is. How quickly are you detecting this, responding to it, and then recovering? What happens on that right-hand side of the boom? And I could tell you, within that 70% number of folks that aren't very concerned about it, they're not even thinking about the right-hand side of the boom. And the criminals know that. Because at the same time, on the left-hand side of the boom, what they're doing is they're doing some reconnaissance. We all have to give so much information about ourselves, about your practices, online. We saw that, right? That's how you grow and all those different types of things. The criminals know that. And so now, instead of getting that email from your long-lost uncle that says, hey, pay me $1,000, I'm going to make you a millionaire in my will, instead, they're going to do what they call socially engineered spear phishing attacks. They're going to make it look like it's coming from a patient, or they're going to make it look like it's coming from one of the vendors that you use, or a former practice you might have worked at. And they're going to try to get you on a Friday afternoon, trying to clean out your inbox, especially before 3-day weekends. And then they're going to catch you asleep at the wheel. They're going to get access, and the reason why they try to do it on a Friday afternoon is because they know that a lot of these folks are not monitoring their systems. It gives them a whole weekend. We just saw the Los Angeles school district got hit on a Friday right before a 3-day weekend. They didn't pay the ransom, and about 500 gigs of information was just released a couple days ago. So, that's how smart these criminals are. And so, when we look at the leverage these folks have, it's two-sided. One, and we could all acronym everybody to death here at a tech conference, but the two that are important are your recovery point objective and the recovery time objective. Left-hand side of the screen, basically, how much data am I at risk of losing, right? Am I taking hourly backups? Can I absorb that? Would I be able to make up and fill in the gaps there for 1 hour? Maybe it's more often. That's something that you would come up with that identification process. And they know most practices are going to be backing up their data. So if that was the only piece of leverage they had, they wouldn't be the 9th largest economy in the world. It's the right-hand side. It's that recovery time objective. That star is how long would it take you to get back and close that loop to make sure that you're recovered and your office and the practice is running business as usual. Would that be several hours, several days, 16.2 days? Most people can't answer it, but that needs to be in your incident response plan. I know one of the roundtables we're doing later is about creating an incident response plan, but that needs to be in there, and then you need to figure out, am I meeting that goal? My goal, everybody's RTO goal is 2 minutes, but realistic RTO goal, am I meeting that goal? And so when you look at what we mean by the continuity of operations and kind of how that differentiates itself from backup, you want to be able to back up your data, and you want to have the 3-2-1 rule. You want to have 3 copies of your data, at least 2 different formats, and then one being at least one off-site. You want to have that in place. But what continuity does is typically, backup's been going on since data existed. It was on a floppy disk, it was on a USB stick, it was on a NAS, whatever that piece of hardware was. And that's great, but all that's doing is backing up files and folders. It's not that simple anymore. So when you think of backup, it needs to be thought of as a complete image of everything that lives on that server or wherever that data lives. So your operating systems, your applications, everything needs to be backed up. Because what that gives you the ability to do is a couple of different things. Now when you set up your schedule, it's going to back up hourly and those type of things. But ultimately, it changes what that response looks like. Instead of your response being, all right, we got to start that restoration and start bringing that data back, and hopefully it happens quickly, and who makes those calls and all the rest. Instead of that being your first reaction is, how do I get everybody access to everything that they had before the attack? I need to get, this practice needs to get up and running. And we'll let the tech folks go and do the forensics. And so what business continuity means is that attack occurs, and you start looking at it's now detected. What's that response and recovery look like? Before you get to the recovery, you want to be able to spin up a virtual instance of that server so that everybody has access to what they need. And you could be in this state for several days, several weeks, for several hours. And then once you figure out what happened, did data actually get stolen? Do we have to order a new piece of hardware? Those type of things. Now you can get all that data back, but with business continuity, you're taking active backups in this state. So now you're back to where you were, not when the attack occurred, not when Jim down the hall didn't do his training and clicked on an email, but instead the moment where you were when you were ready to get that new piece of hardware in place. Because this now takes away that piece of leverage, that right-hand side of the screen. Now you're talking about hours, potentially a day or two, as opposed to weeks, several weeks, those types of things. It turns one of these attacks really into an inconvenience, maybe a couple of hours of downtime and a couple of phone calls, as opposed to a business-threatening event. We see businesses going out of business every single day because of these attacks. And at a minimum, you're going to be able to answer those RTO and RPO questions. And that comes in to a lot of different things. We're seeing on the cyber insurance side that because the underwriting is so difficult, they lost money in 2021. The insurance industry doesn't lose money, right? They lost money on the cyberspace. So they have now revamped that whole underwriting process, right? And they've deemed a lot of businesses and practices uninsurable. And so they want to see that all of these plans are in place and that you actually have data backing up that, yeah, I'm testing these backups. Yeah, I know what my RTO is because that's going to reduce the liability on their end. And you want to have the ability, again, with that 3-2-1 rule to make sure that you have multiple copies. So there's either a local backup as well as that backup up in the cloud. You want to make sure you have access to those different types of things. So you have that ability to go do that. Now, one of the things that we've seen is that, again, with all the great technologies that are out there that allow us to work remote and have access to all these different types of things and communicate with one another and have these online meetings, is that data has moved in a lot of different places. I mentioned it used to be, here's at my server, that's where all my data lives. Thank God we have these, right? It drives business. It allowed us to stay productive and all those different types of things, and they will continue to be very, very innovative software as a service applications. But the criminals know that data lives there now too. So when we looked at our report and we talked to managed service providers that we work with, we saw that about 1 in 4 of them had a client whose one of their SaaS applications was attacked. Now, the majority of those were Microsoft 365. I don't want you to think that's because Microsoft 365 is any more vulnerable. They're actually probably much safer. It's just because the criminals know there's so much data there that where are they going to spend their time? They're going to spend their time where the data lives. Same thing why Windows gets attacked a lot more than Mac. Mac tries to say that, we can't have any viruses. It's not the case. 97% of business data that's on-premise lives on a Windows-based server. And so we saw that. So the majority of them, but we saw it in Dropbox, we saw it in G Suite, we saw it everywhere across those SaaS applications. And you could see, regardless of where you're getting your news from, we see that data being reported. So we see it in our own internal report. We've seen it in some of the other third-party reports, but you could just go online and just search Microsoft 365 attacks. And again, these guys, it's not brute force. They're not going to spend time trying to figure out a way to brute force their way into Microsoft's cloud. What they're going to do is they're going to find the weakest link at an office and have them open the door and let these criminals in. So that data needs to be thought of in the same exact way on the protection side and then the backup side as every piece of your on-premise data. Because Microsoft and most of all SaaS applications have what's called the shared responsibility model. They're going to guarantee the security of their cloud, of the integrity of their cloud. But in terms of the data that lives within it, that's the tenant's responsibility. It's your responsibility. And I've been up to the Burlington, Massachusetts office of Microsoft and sat on panels with their cloud engineers, and they're open to the crowd and say, you bear responsibility here. It's not our fault if you open the door and let them in. There's nothing we can do about that. So they have that shared responsibility model, and they all do. And when you go to Microsoft, you will see that they basically say that. They're not going to have any liability, and they actually, they recommend that you have backup solutions. We actually do a roadshow circuit with them where they don't want to be in the business of backup. They have a great product, and it services a lot of different businesses of all shapes and sizes, but they don't want to be in that space. So they will encourage you. So as you look and you're in that identification process, that first step of the NIST process, you want to make sure that you're identifying where all that data lives, who has access, how it's being protected on the front end, and then who's backing that up and where does that live. And I'll leave you with this. This was, we do our own annual conference every single year. We just had one a couple weeks ago. But back in 2019, we get about 3,000 managed service providers there. So in June of 2019, we had it out in San Diego. We hired a gentleman by the name of Kevin Mitnick. Anybody heard of Kevin Mitnick? At one point, he was on the FBI's most wanted list back in the 90s. He was one of the most notorious hackers in the world. And he got caught and went to jail. And it's like the movie Catch Me If You Can. He came out, now he works with the good guys. He's an ethical hacker, and he goes and trains businesses and the government about how criminals would get in. And this was 2019. He said, if I was a criminal today, I wouldn't be focused on on-premise stuff anymore. I would be focused on Microsoft 365. And he created a live virus. He stood up on stage. This wasn't a click-through, and I can get you the recording of it. But he set up a live virus with 2 different computers, and he said, this is what I would do. So an email would come in. It looks pretty legitimate. Right, he left a couple little Easter eggs in there so techs would know it was fake, but it would come in, Anti-Spam Pro. You sit through a technology conference and you get this email in your inbox at 8:30 in the morning, and you're trying to, I got to update this thing before my first meeting. And so you click on it, right? You look at it, it says, okay, I just need you to enter your credentials here and accept that so that we can implement this. And then once you click on that, every single email in that inbox is encrypted. And the evil thing about it is the only thing you can read is the title, is the headline, so that you know, I got to open this email, but I don't have access to it. And again, back to that idea of who has access to what and that carte blanche admin access piece. If you've got admin access, this can now trickle down to the entire domain. And then the only email you can click on is, again, the scary red screen from Kevin that says, pay me some Bitcoin and I'll unencrypt all of these things. Think about how much that technology has evolved. He was talking about this in 2019. Believe me, the criminals were thinking the same thing. So that was a virus that was very simple. Within 2 minutes, he was able to execute it. Think about how smart these criminals have gotten in the last 3 years, as we've seen exponential growth in all these SaaS applications. They are going to follow the data, they're going to follow the money, and they're going to know that there's a lot of ways they can get in there, and they're going to find that weak link, and they're going to get in. So I don't know if I got any more time, but does anybody have any questions for me? Or obviously I'll be around the next couple of days, but any questions? I answered them all.
There have to be some questions.
Oh, go ahead. 2 questions.
So at what level do you find that they normally go after a practice? Is it like, there's 5 practices, there's 10 practices, is it like an individual practice? Is it just, like, what is the, it's a practice that's evaluated at this much? Like, how do they think about that? Like, at what level would it be normal to do an attack?
We've seen very, very small offices get attacked because they know that those folks can't absorb the downtime. So they will tend to pay. The other piece of it, though, is they will like a larger organization because they can, instead of attacking 50 dental practices, they could attack one parent company and hope to get access to all of them. So we see that it's, kind of the supply chain. We see that with vendors in the space. It's much easier to try to attack a Datto and try to infiltrate other million businesses that have a Datto device, or, a managed service provider who might have 100 clients, because instead of attacking 100, you only need to attack one. They're thinking about it in that same way. So they will, that's a more attractive, because it's less work. If they can get into one and they have access to everything, well, that's a lot easier than trying to attack 50 or 100. But there isn't a threshold. We see the small ones. There are some of these asks that are $300. They're not a lot. They deal in volume. And again, it goes back to singles hitter or home run hitter. There are some folks that would say, I could just attack, I won't even do the social engineering. I could send out these easy to decipher emails, but I know I'll still get people to click on them, so I'll send out 10,000 of those today. So there isn't an easy answer to it. There isn't a threshold. But we do know that the majority of attacks are happening at the small business level, which we consider, 100 to 150 seats and below, because of that. It's easier to get through, and they could do volume-based attack, and that they know they'll get more payments.
So do you have scaled solutions just based upon the size of the practice or the DSO? Do you guys scale? And then I assume that you help with all the planning and then all of the backup and so all the steps that you share?
Yeah, so we would work with Sunset on that. Yeah, but that's exactly right. So there's very small 1 terabyte devices, scale up to 60 terabyte devices. And the reporting wise, every backup's tested. The virtualization capabilities that we showed, those are all tested every single night. So there's documentation there for all the regulatory and insurance information. But yeah, that's the thing. The biggest thing is that it's not, again, a commodity. Like if somebody says, well, what do I need? Until you evaluate your network and all those things, there isn't an answer to that. So it's, that would be, Patrick and his team would
Yeah, and I'll just add, I don't know if you can hear me, but we work very closely with Datto, and just as Michael is saying, and by the way, Michael and I have co-presented a lot, so I love the way he talks about this stuff. It's amazing. Go back to the NIST standard. That is an FBI endorsed standard. It's a nationally recognized standard. It's about the business continuity, but it's about the whole wheel. So think about it holistically. If you're just going to try and do, solve one little thing and put a great firewall in, you're done. And that's really what Michael was talking about before. Then size doesn't matter, right? So, we had another question, I think, right here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think you kind of alluded to some of this when you're talking about what happens after the boom and what you're doing, but how do you change that emotional reaction that someone has around this? Because you can have the best technologies, but if somebody doesn't put their hand up and call the right people at the right time, what are your suggestions around what you can do to build that, make that part of your culture in an organization?
So I would say two things. One, and again, it's just kind of human nature. As you're creating, if you don't have an incident response plan or you're updating your incident response plan, get buy-in from everyone. Because people like to be part of it. So if they get buy-in and you understand, well, these are the tools that I'm using, you'll see there's a lot, they call it shadow technology. A lot of times one person doesn't even know that there's another application that's being used. So get buy-in from everybody. And then if somebody new comes into the organization, don't just have it, as here's your onboarding, take this 30-minute course and this is your security training. It needs to be ongoing. At Datto, we have ongoing, I'll get fake phishing emails all the time, and I'm supposed to say, all right, forward it on to our phishing team, and they'll say, hey, congratulations, you spotted it. If you do wind up clicking on one of these, you'll get a congratulatory email that says, congratulations, you just re-enrolled yourself in the cyber training because you didn't listen the first time. So you will see click rates drop almost immediately if you just have something simple. And again, these aren't expensive, like we don't offer, but just find a tool. Like we use Know before internally, but go find one of the tools out there that are ongoing training, because then you're always vigilant. Because I get scared about opening anything. Those people are probably annoyed at me because anything that looks suspicious, I just forward it to them. But those are the two main things. So in terms of getting buy-in of the culture, ongoing training, and then I really believe in a collaborative type of issue so that, at least every little department, but hopefully everybody has some sort of say in it, because then they feel like they own it. Don't do any of those Facebook quizzes, because those are just gathering data on you. You might know everything about a Disney movie, but don't click on that thing. So, all right, cool. Awesome, thank you so much.